can. Spins a web any size, catches thieves just like flies. Look out, here comes the Spider-Man. Is he strong?
Hello and welcome to Amazing Spider-Man Classics, your favorite podcast for all early Spider-Man stories. My name is John Wilson, and here in the studio with me is Josh Bertone and Don Grant. The mission of this podcast is to talk about all the early appearances of Spider-Man and his various titles and guest appearances from the beginning with Amazing Fantasy 15 and Spider-Man #1, and working forward until we just can't go anymore. And let's see, before we get started, in case you haven't ever heard any of us on our other shows, Don, why don't you talk about some of the other things that you do?
All right. Well, first show I was on, which I'm still doing, but we're set to record tomorrow, is the Spectacular Whips podcast. That's where my co-host Thomas Mattis and myself go over the recent Spectacular Spider-Man cartoon. We go over monthly, episode by episode, and give it its due because it's a great show. And I've recently become a regular along with our pal Bertone on the Clone Saga Chronicles, which with Zach Joyner and friends, we go over the 90s Clone Saga from the comics, and give that its due, get what it did right, what it did wrong, and have a heck of a good time along the way. So it's all Spider-Man crap I'm involved with.
And it's all good stuff too. Okay, Josh, I know that you have quite an extensive list of everything you're involved in right now. Why don't you go ahead and give the listeners a rundown of it?
I'll give a Cliff Notes version.
Version.
Yeah, there's some non-comic things that I don't think that the people really care about. Spider-Man related stuff I do is I am involved with the Spider-Man Crawl Space website. I do some series for them. I do Spider-Man Memories, although I haven't done that in a while, where it's different pictures of the day of Spider-Man. Very, 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 very infrequent is Spider-Man Revisions, which I'm not even going to try and explain the concept of that behind here. Just go to Spider-Man Crawl Space, check out, and other stuff like a Gwen series and just different articles for the front page. In terms of podcasts and other websites, for SpideyDude.com, I'm involved in some different stuff with our friend Zachary Joyner, a.k.a. Spidey Dude, on there, including the podcast Clone Saga Chronicles, which is, if you're enjoying this look back at the 60s, but want another look back and want one that's more extreme and holographic and hecka confusing, you can listen to Clone Saga Chronicles, the podcast. We are covering the 90s Spider-Man Clone Saga with our friend Donovan Morgan Grant, as he said. For Examiner.com, I do the Spider-Man Examiner column, which is great fun. If you like other comics aside from Spider-Man, you can hear me covering the Marvel Comics Star Wars series, issue by issue. It's very, very short and sweet. That podcast, they usually don't go over about 15 to 20 minutes. There's also the Batman Universe podcast that I do with my friends Dustin, Apples, Zach, a different Zach, and countless others. That show has a lot of people. And now I'm out of breath, so that's if you want to know more, just check my Facebook page.
And I am also involved in another podcast called Teenage Wasteland and Ultimate Spider-Man podcast with my friend, another Zach Henderson, where we've been looking at every issue of the Brian Michael Bendis series in order from #1, and that's been lots of fun too. But my heart and my first love really does belong with this classic Spider-Man stuff, these early issues. This is what I grew up reading, and this is where my love lies. So today we're going to be covering Amazing Fantasy 15. Before we get started,
I just forgot to mention, Josh mentioned his Spider-Man Crawl Space stuff. I actually do reviews for both the Spectacular Spider-Man cartoon and the 90s show, so y'all can check that out if you like, or not. Who cares?
Cool. And Marvel has a lot of those 90s episodes up on their website now, which is pretty cool.
That was my introduction to Spider-Man, and it's funny because doing this podcast, I actually sought these issues out originally, and I got them in different forms like Essentials and a series that was running at the time, which was ironically called Spider-Man Classics. And it really blew my mind that like the continuity was different than it was on the show. Like I knew that it took place in different continuities, but it's like, wait a second, Felicia wasn't his college classmate. What's going on with these people who he's meeting out of order? You mean Venom came this late in the game when he married?
He wasn't designed off of Nicholas Hammond? What?
Oh, I didn't even get the Nicholas Hammond thing until years later, and I'm glad I didn't. That may have ruined it for me. Yeah, I love the cartoon series, the '90s one. And what I loved about it was like a serialized cartoon because when you're a kid and you're watching these cartoons, a lot of the times what happens in one episode won't have any effect on what happens in the other episodes. You can watch 90 episodes of Phineas and Ferb, and each episode it's like a jumping on point, really. I'm just
Hmm.
using that as an example of a kid show that's on now. With Spider-Man, they would draw on stuff that was happening in past episodes, and as the show got older and older, they got into arcs and stuff. And now it wasn't like a perfect, beginning to end show, but they had their arcs and they had their continuity. And I like that. And I sought out the comics. I was already a big comic reader with Star Wars. So it was just a case of crossing over into Spider-Man Marvel stuff. And I jumped right in and I was going to garage sales as a prepubescent and getting, hundreds of comics in some weekends and just reading them all hundreds and hundreds of times.
How about you, Don? How'd you get into comics and Spider-Man in particular?
Well, I was sort of like Josh in that the '90s show was a big contributing factor, but it was kind of the other way around. I remember ads in the summer for the show leading up to it, and that got me interested in the character. I remember explicitly thinking that for some reason Spider-Man was a brand new character, so I was like, let me check out this new Spider-Man guy. So I went to the nearest toy store and got some Spider-Man toys. At the same time, that was when the Clone Saga was really starting to hit up in 1994. So I sometimes I wasn't a collector until I was much older to actually spend money on it. But I got into Spider-Man through that. Through comic books, I've always been a fan of superheroes. I always watched the cartoons. I've been a Batman fan as long as I can remember. So I've always been kind of into just that kind of storytelling. So when I was old enough to understand what was going on, I would start buying comics. The earliest comics I remember consecutively buying was the DC versus Marvel crossover, which to me was my version of Secret Wars, I guess, to some of the people, and that was a big contributing factor. And when I was older, I would pick up Ultimate Spider-Man and Spider-Man, ASM, Batman when the whole Bruce Wayne murderer storyline's going on, and basically since I've been a teenager, 13, 14, I've been a collector, and I've been going strong ever since.
I had a lot more involvement in Spider-Man than I remember having because there are pictures and I have vague memories. I know that I watched Spider-Man: The Amazing Friends. I know that I watched the '90s series, and I know that I had a Spider-Man doll from when I was old enough to walk, like one of those really big old 16-inch stuffed Spider-Man toys. And but what I remember is. In the late 70s, Marvel put out these 3 pocketbook-sized paperbacks that between the 3 of them, they reprinted the first 20 issues of Amazing Spider-Man. And I remember reading those when I was 6 years old and I had the chicken pox. And I probably read those over and over and over again all through my childhood years. And, I knew those stories backwards and forwards, especially the first ones, because, I would start over again so many times. But then it was the early 90s. I think my first comic I bought off the shelf was Amazing Spider-Man 341, where he suddenly is powerless. And I was blown away because all these things were different from the first 20 issues. He and Flash Thompson were friends, and he was married to this hot redhead. I was like, what the frack's going on here? And, all this other stuff. But I didn't stay collecting that long. It was around the Maximum Carnage story that I just didn't have the funds to collect anymore. And then I
You
grew
missed
up.
out.
Yeah, I know. I missed out on a lot of stuff. But
Oh yeah.
shortly after One More Day, I started reading again. So now I've been filling my brain with all these back issues, and it's been a really really fun ride. I have to say I really enjoy reading the older stuff more than the newer stuff, but maybe it's
Can't
just because I'm
imagine
old.
Maybe it's because no comment.
why.
Well, 10 years from now we'll be able to have our conversations about it.
10 years from now, somebody's going to do a podcast looking at all the comic books from like when One More Day happened to like beyond, because that'll be their favorite era.
Right. I mean, there are all those letters they publish in the back of the books now where people are raving and raving about the greatness that is post One More Day. I don't think very many people liked One More Day, even those who do like everything that's happened since.
I don't
But
think the people involved in One More Day liked it.
I think
Especially when one
there's
of the writers wanted his name removed from the story.
I think the only
That's
person
very
that really
telling.
liked One More Day was the person that wrote it.
One More
But
Day was
anyways, we're not
this
going to
one.
talk about that because we're here to talk about better things.
Don't worry, this isn't going to be a brand new day bashing podcast.
We're going to try to spend as little time talking about modern Spider-Man comics as possible.
Except when it's relevant in certain cases.
Yeah, and occasionally we'll have stuff that reminds us of other stuff. So, Amazing Fantasy 15. A couple of technical details. The cover, which is an awesome cover, actually has Jack Kirby pencils with Steve Ditko
Yes.
inking it. That's a Jack Kirby-esque pose for Spider-Man, and Ditko went in and drew all the webs and everything. And Artie
And yet,
Simek is the one who
Jack
designed.
Kirby's kids want to claim that Jack Kirby helped create Spider-Man. But nevertheless,
Nevertheless, Artie Simek did the lettering on the front and the logo design, because this is the first and, well, for a very, very long time, last issue of Amazing Fantasy. It had a different name before that, so we get to thank Artie Simek for
It
that.
was Amazing Fantasy, but then it was Amazing Adult Fan. So I think that it was Amazing Fantasy again at one, earlier in the series.
Amazing Adventures for the first 6 issues, and then Amazing Adult Fantasy until 14.
all the controversy.
I could
Was
be
Amazing Fantasy like his book, or was it like an anthology writer's book?
It was a Lee and Ditko book. Amazing Adventures, Amazing Adult Fantasy, all 15 issues, basically a Lee and Ditko anthology book.
Okay, because like one of my notes said this alone, because this is initially started as a standalone story, is such a Ditko story, like in terms of storytelling.
Actually, there's a letter in this issue that I was going to bring up later, where he talks about how he pulled adult because some kids were complaining like they didn't feel like they were cool enough to buy Amazing Adult Fantasy, and so there was the name was actually putting them off. But
because these stories were so obviously written for adults if you read them.
Exactly. And according to
Ditko
Wiki,
stories were they've recently. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to step on you, John.
it's okay. I was just going to say that according to Wiki, I was wrong. It's not just Ditko. There were Kirby stories in here too. I know a lot of the stories were Ditko stories.
Yeah, well, a lot of the stories that he wrote were kind of like not just like straight up, but the old kids can't read them, but they were a lot, or for the lack of a better phrase, mature than what other stuff Marvel was putting out back then.
I haven't read a lot of the old Amazing Adult Fantasy stuff. I've read some of them. And from what I've seen, that whole thing with Spider-Man's origin, it actually fits what they did in a lot of those stories, because it was kind of like a Twilight Zone or something thing where there'd be a story and there'd be a twist at the end. Like one that I read is there's a report on the news that aliens have landed and everyone's looking for them. And then it's a husband and wife. They're worried about, what if they're going to find us? What are we going to do? And you think that they're worried about the aliens. And, it's not safe to go out. And then at the end you find out that the husband and the wife are actually the aliens.
Yeah, that's the last story in this book. Yeah, it's a good story.
Yeah, they do different twists. And that's what the Spider-Man thing was. It was an Aesop's fable.
If it had never taken off, it would have been a really good, just Twilight Zone style story. And actually, Michael Bailey has a short essay he wrote on his blog, Fortress of Baileytude, I think, that talks about looking at the Spider-Man origin story from a EC magazine and 50s style horror sci-fi, looking at this story from that point of view, and it really, really does fit.
It's the whole twist at the end. Oh my God, the burglar was the guy who I let get away, and it's the Aesop's fable. He should have been.
And I think that's why one of the things that
French
bothers me most about this story is how they breeze through his discovery of his powers. But I think that actually works better because they want to get to the rest of the story. The story is not about what powers he has. The story is about everything else that happens to him. And
exactly. I'm surprised that bothers you. I mean, cause like we've been saying, this was supposed to be like a one-off, and it works so beautifully just as a one-shot story. I didn't. I mean, to each his own, but
as a Spidey,
I can't see what you're saying, Bill.
As a Spidey origin. It depends on your perspective. As a Spidey origin, I would have liked to have seen him happen across his powers more accidentally in a more natural fashion. He basically crams discovery of every single ability he has, except for his spider sense, into 6 panels. And I know they had 11 pages to tell their story, and so I'm not faulting them for it, but it is one aspect of the story.
And that was storytelling back then. Speaking of how he discovers his powers, when he jumps onto that building because he's almost hit by the car, read what the people who are driving the car are saying. It's like really sadistic. It's there's one egghead who won't date you anymore when he crosses the street.
You could say that again.
Say that again. It's like, oh my God, you are horrible people.
You're trying to kill the teenager.
Yeah, he's.
Well, this is New York.
The poor little guy in the necktie and little vest.
Like, do they drive around doing this?
The first 3 pages of this story are everybody having it out for Peter Parker. Like, the professors make fun of him, the teenagers make fun of him, even the guys in the cars are trying to kill him.
I noticed that too, that the scientists, the other adults, like, they know who he is. So you got to think, and that's one thing that hasn't really been explored as much, is that Peter Parker, he was known around the scientific community at least. I mean, not as a scientist or anything, but the adults knew.
As like an up-and-coming student.
Yeah, because he was going to these exhibits and stuff. But the funny thing is, even the adults pick on him.
Like, too bad, he must have a weak stomach.
Oh, that Parker. And that thought hadn't really occurred to me. And they even adapt that in the '90s series. Like I remember that because when they
Yeah,
redid his origin in that one
Connors made
episode,
fun of him
Connors made fun of him.
because
I don't remember.
Connors and Farley Stillwell was at the origin, and when he gets bitten and starts like walking around, both I think Connors is the one that says looks like Parker has a case of a bad stomachache or something like that. I'll have to wait till I review it, but yeah, I think.
Interesting.
And that kid who sees him walking up the wall, and then his mom's like, "That's the last horror movie I take you to." I love to imagine that this kid spent the rest of his life trying to convince his mother that Spider-Man exists, but she would always narrowly like misseen him and think that her kid was just a liar.
It's like Snuffleup, I guess.
He'd like, look, I have this copy of the Daily Bugle, and like she turns around, the wind's
And
blown
spills
it away
coffee
or
on it.
something, or like,
That's like a Roger Moore James Bond gag.
the kid's like, let's see, if depending on how much Spider-Man's age, which is debatable, but the kid's like, maybe about to graduate high school or something now, and he's still trying to convince his mom there's a Spider-Man.
And he like
And
turns
she's
into a supervillain out of rage that he can't convince his mother there's a Spider-Man. I'm going to tell a Spider-Man to me, mother, and then you'll feel
okay, whatever, you and your delusions. I want to see another horror movie, darn it. I only got to see one.
I only
Why-
got to see the one. I mean, obviously he had issues because, I mean, seeing a movie makes him see hallucinations on the side of the building.
Then there's the other explanation that maybe his mom did see it too, but she's just a jerk. She's kind of like got a nanny from the Muppets Baby thing going on, like you just see her legs.
So the issue has an August 1962 cover date on the outside, but the indicia on the inside says September 1962.
Let's say that. I mean, I don't have the issue.
You know how at the bottom of like usually on the first page of a comic it'll have like the official name of the comic and all the publication information, all the legalese. It says September 1962 down there.
Okay, because that's cut out from my copy.
It would be I'm looking at the official. The way I'm reading these is the DVD that Marvel released of the official Spider-Man scans, or the official 40 years of Spider-Man. Then they scanned them all. They had the inside front cover where it's teaching you how to draw on the first day, and it has this woman in her underwear posing so you can draw her. And at the bottom it says Amazing Fantasies published blah blah blah.
Amazing adult fantasy indeed. Draw naked women.
Shit.
But it was released with the last wave of August books on June 5th of 1962, 1 week before the September books started coming out. So I'm going with the August as the date, but it probably doesn't matter to anyone but me.
Comic book cover dates, they're just... Now, I know why they used to do it, because they didn't want it to look like books had been on the shelf for a while, so sometimes cover dates were post-dated. But I think now, the way that the comic book community and fan base works, I think it's just stupid now.
And so a legend is born, and a new name is added to the roster of those who make the world of fantasy the most exciting realm of all.
Well, Stan Lee was all about the hype. I mean,
Yes.
right now he has girl comics, he has Western comics, and he has the Fantastic Four and the Incredible Hulk. And that's
Stan
all
Lee-
he has for superheroes. And now he's like trying to put this title out there. And
I mean, he was right. Give the guy credit, he was right, but it's also kind of funny.
He could make a TV dinner seem like a 5-star meal.
I know, right?
He's Stan Lee.
Yeah,
So-
I mean, Stan kind of has like we all love him, but we also kind of rag on him just because like the way he wrote. But like when you put him in context, and like we will, like these stories are these really are excellent written stories.
I think Spider-Man and Fantastic Four, having read a lot of everything else that was coming out at this time, Stan Lee's wonky dialogue gets more wonky in books like Hulk and Iron Man and stuff. The Spider-Man and Fantastic Four books were really, really written well. And it gets better if post 1965, it really curves up in the quality.
Now I've not read that much early. I've read some early. I mean, I actually owned the first volume of Daredevil. I've read some early Fantastic Four, but it seems to me that with the Spider-Man, with Amazing Spider-Man, it seems that Peter, the stories are more centered around Peter than anything else, and that's what grabbed readers. The guy who looks like a dork and can't get a break. The fact that the focus is concentrated on him so much is what really keeps the reader coming back in, because they want to see how this guy, who's basically themselves, will rate against everything else.
So at the end of, and I know we're going to talk about modern comics very much, but at the end of the Swing Shift book that came out before Brand New Day started, there's like a 3 or 4 page essay or letter to the department,
The manifesto.
basically describing what makes Spider-Man good. One of the things I think they really, really hit on in that manifesto was Peter Parker is what Spider-Man is about. And if you lose your focus on Peter Parker, then you lose your focus on why you're writing this book. And whether they really effectively implemented that in Brand New Day is up for debate. But I think that's definitely true in these early issues, is that this book's about Peter Parker.
Exactly.
He puts on a costume, he beats up bad guys, but he takes off the costume and he doesn't know how to talk to girls.
Right. And any scene that's not with Peter is just to carry the plot. Like you get the voice of reaction all about from Peter's point of view, which works.
And in regards to him not knowing how to talk to girls, you'll see that in Amazing Spider-Man issue 7, because the way he talks to Betty at the end of that issue, like, my God, Stan doesn't know how to talk to girls. I mean, no wonder he married Madam Web.
It reminds me of some things I've said over the years. But digging into the issue now, and that we've been on the show for, I don't know how long, 15 minutes now. The opening splash, everyone, of course, is making fun of Peter, totally setting the tone for what we were just talking about. And the thing that I love about this panel is Flash Thompson, because I think that the main reason he's allowed to pick on Peter Parker is because he wears purple pants.
I can't tell. I have the black and white version, so I can't tell. I thought it was because he looks like Ralph Malph from Happy Days.
Yeah, Cha-Cha from a Waltz. There's an outdated reference right there. If this was published today, it would be like, he doesn't know the Soulja Boy from the...
From Stanky Leg.
Yeah. Say, gang, we need one more guy for the dance. How about Peter Parker over there? Yo, homies, we need one more guy for the rave. How about Peter Parker over there? Are you kidding me? That bookworm.
And when they say bookworm or
which would be
wallflower?
which would be replaced by another word that I won't say because I don't want to offend anybody, but what other kids call other kids put them down now. That wouldn't know a Soulja Boy from a stanky leg.
Exactly. And this first paragraph, like, this is incinerated in my brain. I've read this first paragraph so many times. Do you like costume heroes? Confidentially, we in the comic mag business refer to them as long underwear characters. And as you know, they're a dime a dozen, but we think you may find our Spider-Man just a bit different.
That's a good Stanley. A good young Stanley.
I love how it's confidentially, but he's announcing it.
Right. You know,
that's not confidential.
He's only printing 100,000 copies of this issue.
Now, it's interesting.
I don't know how many were being sold back then. That would be curious to get sales figures.
The one thing I do know, and this is, another era, but in 1980, there's like issue 203 or something, they actually published the sales figures in the back of a letters column, and there were 580,000 copies of that issue printed, as opposed to 20-odd thousand of the average Amazing Spider-Man now.
It was a bestseller, yeah.
Well, comics were a bigger medium back then.
Yeah.
All across the board, they were like Golden Age. There was like, stuff in the millions.
I've heard many times that 1953, just for sheer number of books printed on the shelves, 1953 is comics' biggest year.
They didn't have video games or there was TV wasn't as big, but they didn't have video games and other stuff to compete with. I mean, now it's stick a kid in front of Cartoon Network and they'll be occupied for the day, or they'll save up to buy the video game. They don't. The kids who I work with, because I work in childcare, they'll read comics if the comics are out, but they won't seek them out.
No, my daughter loves comics. She loves the stuff. She asks me to buy things. She has her Supergirl showcases that she reads in her spare time, and she loves comics.
Cool. I was going to say, I think it's interesting, the splash page in the beginning sets you up, okay, Peter Parker's this big, no loser at school. He's, unlikable. But then the very next page, the first 3 panels are him being happy and, being accoladed by these adults. Oh, you're great, Peter. Keep up the good work and you're sure scholarship and everything. I thought it was a good juxtaposition. But then, so it kind of takes the reader in and out. And then when you get back to school, they show how crappy his life is.
I think it's your classic nerd syndrome. They relate better to people who are older than they are. I say they. We, or at least I, when I was a kid, related better to people who were older than I was. I never really did relate to my peers very well.
Apparently not, because the adults make fun of him on the very next page. But
those are some really mean adults.
No, they're scientists, so it's the nerds.
I know,
those
right?
are they're probably the adults that get made fun of. So he's like the bottom of the food chain. But
this is also back in back when the day where being a scientist was like the end all be all job. Like everything was solved with science, and we must dedicate this in the name of science.
Science.
So atomic radiation in an open room.
We have different parts of the country represented here. I'm not sure exactly where y'all are from, but does any of you know exactly what wheat cakes are? Because I've never had wheat cakes.
That's a good question.
I don't know if they're just
recipe published in the back of an amazing, in an Untold Tales annual. And I was like, Mom, and I was, maybe 11. I was like, Mom, wheat cakes. Here's the recipe. You got to make them. That's Spider-Man's favorite. And she I remember she looked at the recipe. She's like, Joshua, that's disgusting. You're not gonna like that at all.
That's disgusting.
But yeah, don't fatten him up too much, dear. I can hardly out wrestle him now. Which, oh, that's a sweet line. But then you think, wait a second. Peter's too old to still be wrestling with his uncle, and his uncle is way too old to still be wrestling with him.
How old do you guys think Aunt May and Uncle Ben are in this thing?
They
I
honestly
think- I
look
think-
at least
They look ancient in this.
at least 70.
Okay, here's my thing. I think that try not to steer away from the future. I think that in this, starting from the very beginning, Aunt May is about 55, and like in the current book, she's about 70.
They gave her
That's-
age in the Marvel Knight Spider-Man. I think they said what'd they say, 75. I know you said we're staying away from that.
I honestly don't know. I think every artist who has taken her has done different things with her. When we get, about a month or two from now, when we get to Johnny Romita, his first drawings of Aunt May, she looked like she was about to fall out the mummy case.
Actually, she looks younger than she does. Like there's some future
Yeah.
Dick wishes where she looks even older.
She
Like
used
in the Spider-Man Quits arc that Ditko did, where Spider-Man puts the costume in the paperback.
Yeah.
And going back to that whole wrestling comment, he's like stroking Peter's shoulder as he's saying that.
I think he's just, patting his bicep there. I don't think there's any weird man.
Yeah, I mean,
There
my dad
isn't.
did that.
It's Uncle Ben, but just out of context. And like, if you were the witness this scene today, it wouldn't look. But I mean, that's the thing. It was the '60s. Back then, an uncle could, touch his nephew and talk about wrestling with him, and nobody thought anything of it.
I don't know that I would.
Yeah, I don't think that's that bad. But
Yeah.
there are some other stuff that we could think it's bad, but
Of course, that's Mr. Warren, who's not yet named, his teacher, not to be confused with Professor Warren, his brother, who becomes Peter's college professor.
And does bad things later.
Yeah,
crazy.
and
things.
very next panel, Peter's first time getting shot down by a woman. That's Sally, who
Sally, is it
Bluebird.
Avril or Avril, or how do you say her
I
last
say
name?
Avril.
Avril?
yeah, she was later expanded upon in
Untold Tales.
Untold Tales, and she actually became a vigilante called the Bluebird.
Really?
And she wound up down. Yeah,
I think I wikied her once. I think I read something about a bluebird once, and I had to wiki her, and I saw it was Sally.
It's interesting because her personality in Untold Tales is actually a little different. She's a little more of an adventure seeker than just like a straight up snobby.
Well, she
girl.
doesn't get. I mean, she gets 2 panels here, so we don't see a whole lot of her personality except that she's snobbing off on Peter.
she tolerates Peter a lot more there, and like she even comes to his house and stuff, and sometimes she goes up behind him, touches him on the shoulders, which is really funny because her counterpart in Spectacular Spider-Man. Oh my God, what a dork!
Yeah, what's he doing here? Tell me about it.
Ah,
Oh, that's Sally. That's right. She's
Yeah,
really
They
obnoxious.
Make her
in
blonde in
Spectacular.
that show.
I really like Spectacular Spider-Man, but she's obnoxious in that.
I love her in that. She's hilarious.
Yeah, it's kind of love to hate kind of thing.
And they actually did the whole thing of him asking her out in the first episode. But it's funny because she's like, hey, Flash Thompson, he's a dreamboat, but Flash is in the Untold Tales and in other issues. She never really shows a romantic interest in Flash again.
I admire good taste, dog. Get lost, bookworm. And I love
Well, I
that.
He's
think
still the mob boss.
I think it's one of those cases where it's like if somebody's hitting on you, you pretend to be dating somebody else. It's like, yeah, I'm here with him. So it's like she sees Peter, she's like, I'm with Flash. Yeah,
It's like
Flash is one of my favorite characters from the Ditko run, just because he's in there so many times. It's quite entertaining.
he doesn't appear in issue 1 of Amazing. Funnily
Flash doesn't?
enough, nope, he
What,
doesn't.
are there any school scenes in the issue 1?
There is, but
Yeah,
Flash
there
is there.
Are you
Okay.
sure? We'll get to that. We'll get to that.
So the T sweater on Flash, another reason why he shouldn't be picking on anybody, because obviously he doesn't know how to dress.
His mother
Um,
did it for him.
And this is where Peter Parker, at the bottom of this page, he goes off in a fit of rage and gets bitten by a spider and becomes an evil supervillain. Except that he doesn't. But seriously, it's like, someday I'll show them. They'll be sorry. Sorry they laughed at me. It's like,
You forgot to say sob.
I sobbed internally.
That's one thing about these 60 books, and not just with Marvel, but DC did it too. They'd have characters say sob or choke out loud when they were sad. Nobody does that.
I think
Lois Lane
the
used to
idea
say
is
choke
that
a
they're
lot.
sobbing, they're sobbing and choking. They're not saying sob and choke. But
It's
no.
it's in the speech bubble.
So we talked about the lab scene with the professors making fun of him, and then he feels a strange burning in his body, like puberty just hit, and almost gets hit by a car.
Yeah, the really, really bad motorists.
Yeah, the evil car drivers. And then he's crawling up the wall, and poor little boy who This is the kind of boy who flushes the toilet and runs out of the bathroom because he's scared of the noise.
Yeah, it was scared of a vacuum cleaner. Yeah.
He's like,
He
"Mommy,
looks
look at the walk." And the woman beside him says, "Wah wah 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 wah."
he looks really short too. He's like barely up to that woman's thigh. That's one like really small kid.
Really little. Why is she taking her 3-year-old to horror movies?
They were sold out of Diary of a Wimpy Kid or whatever else. Like,
So he gets up there, he grabs the steel pipe, and what you don't see is he grabs it and crushes it, and he's off balance, so he like slips and almost falls off the building.
the funny thing is, he's like, I've got to plan what to do with this unbelievable ability that fate gave me. I've got to have time to think. He's got to have time to think and plan. And then the next panel, a few minutes later. Oh, wrestling. Okay.
Oh.
That's enough. That's enough thinking.
Ooh, look, something shiny.
He's like, I will take years to plan this out. Ooh.
Yeah, well, he's a teenager. He's a teenager. So.
Yes, that's true.
This was like a pre-MTV teenager, so like, his attention span was probably a little bigger than ours. If this was published now, it would be like 10 seconds later.
So they do the wrestling thing, which every version of Spider-Man has had. I really liked this scene, actually, the way it played out in the Spider-Man movie. But whenever he finally throws the guy off his shoulder and he's like, you're not human. Nobody can do that. I've always wanted Peter Parker to say, well, then meet Mr. Nobody. And
instead of one of that.
That's probably why I don't write comic books.
That guy's a big wimp. Like,
Crusher
as soon as he realizes that he's outmatched, he's crying like a little baby.
Like, the only time he looks confident is whenever Peter Parker is outside the ring. Every other expression on his face is like, oh my god!
Yeah, and of course they later brought back Crusher Hogan in the 80s in that good story. I think it's called Whatever Happened to Crusher Hogan. It was around
that was a more recent story.
Was that the sequel to Whatever Happened to the Man of Tomorrow?
Yes, it was this because what DC decided to do for their sequel to that great Alan Moore story was to get Tom DeFalco to write it and to make it a Spider-Man story, and to have Marvel do it.
Tom DeFalco writing a sequel to Alan Moore. That's awesome.
Yeah.
And we've got Maxie Schiffman and his cute little hat there.
Yeah.
I love that hat. That's an awesome hat. It like screams like I'm a political voting rally or something.
Is that his name, Maxie Schiffman?
Yes, it is.
Really?
A TV producer named Schiff, and who they also brought back in the 90s. Well, Crusher Hogan was the 80s, but they brought back Maxie Schiffman in the 90s, back when they were doing 30th anniversary of Spider-Man. I believe he was brought back in, because for the 30th anniversary stuff, they had the 3 titles. Amazing did the story about Peter's parents coming back. Spectacular did the story about Harry throwing that very, very awkward dinner party. And I think Webb was Mysterio, like using Maxie Schiffman against Spider-Man and making Spider-Man think that he was still like a wrestler and everything, and that like the rest of his life was an illusion.
Hey Don, you don't have color in yours. Just imagine that hat. The little diagonal stripes are the same red as the Spider-Man suit. And the rest of the hat is Smurf blue.
Look at the guy behind Crusher Hogan. Behind Maxie Schiffman. Look at that guy.
What is that face?
Yeah.
Yeah.
The thing is, I've seen guys like that. It's kind of weird. Ditko does good faces, though. I like his face.
He sews and designs his own costume. It is worth noting that in a lot of the reprints, they changed the color to the spider on the back from blue to red. Because it is changed from... once you get to Amazing Spider-Man, the title, the spider on the back becomes red permanently with no explanation. And John Byrne, when he did Chapter 1, he made an effort to explain that. He did like a throwaway line of dialogue when Spider-Man goes to see the Fantastic Four. Well, because I'm going to see the Fantastic Four, I'm going to change that spider on the back of my costume from blue to red. Okay.
I never realized it was blue. You're right, it is blue. There's one panel where it's colored red, but all the rest of them it's colored blue. I never realized that.
A lot of the reprints, like in Spider-Man Classics and sometimes even Masterworks, I think.
So is it like an outline then? Because since the back was blue.
The blue is it's a different shade of blue.
Well, this is inked pretty heavily. There's actually very little blue in the blue, what we think of as the blue areas of Spider-Man costume. Right. It's mostly black with blue highlights, but the spider is where it's white in your book, it's blue in ours.
Well, actually, yeah, it is like mainly black and white. And this is the thing. We're getting to the thing that's like really kind of controversial in hindsight, because they always mention, oh, Peter Parker's a science quote unquote major, even though he's in high school, yet he builds the web shooters. And
yes.
Even today, they still go about the idea that he's able to do that.
This is like the awesomest part of the story. He basically invents a fracking modern miracle. I don't understand why people give him such a hard time, because obviously being bitten by a radioactive spider giving him spider powers is okay, but web shooters, that's just impossible.
I don't really hear a lot of people complain about that except for non-comic fans. I think that most comic fans are accepting that he created the web shooters.
But I thought that was the whole like logic behind the organic webbing development is that you can't.
Sam
Yeah,
Raimi's thing was
but that came out of Hollywood though,
Yeah.
not.
Was that a see? I wasn't reading comics when the movie came out. Was that originated in the movie and then like went over?
What
to
happened
comics?
was that Sam Raimi said that if Peter Parker was so smart to make up web series, he didn't see why he couldn't just sell that and become rich.
Well, he tried to, and later on in the Lee Ditko run, and the guy's like, "Oh, yeah, this is great. Yeah, and it melts in an hour. So I'm going to sell people a glue that melts in an hour and doesn't work anymore. Get the heck out of my office."
It reminds me of the origin story of Post-it notes. Post-it notes came out of an accident because the guy is trying to come up with a new kind of
Michelle
glue.
invented that.
And the glue on the back of Post-it notes is not very strong, but it's awesome. But it was new because no one ever thought a glue could be used in that way.
While we're on designs, we should probably talk about like this is the early days, so you have the ever-changing Spider-Man design. Like for one thing, the web pits are down to what is known as the greater trochanter, which is basically the part where your hip meets the leg. And
Those are
sometimes they're shown just in the armpits.
Yeah, those are some really massively huge web pits. And they put web pits on his costume in the live action series, and that totally illustrated why he should never have web pits. Because they're just like flopping around. Did you like those?
The web pits always bothered me, and it's partially because I came in the Spider-Man through the 90s show, and I know that it originated in the comics and it was there from the first appearance, so it shouldn't bother me, and it goes against every fiber of my being to have them bother me, but it just does.
Well, it's like if you were to move it into live action, if there was a way to make them always taut, like always, tight across that gap between his upper arm and torso, to me that'd be fine. But you can't do that in real life. It has to be a fabric and it has to flap around, and I just don't like that look.
I think it doesn't make sense, but I don't mind the design. But I do agree that either you put them on there or you don't. So in this one and in the first issue, we will have something I've never seen before again in a Spider-Man comic, which is part 2, and the next one has part 2 and 3.
Well, there was a reason for that actually. This Amazing Fantasy was a 5-story book.
Oh, really?
And
Okay.
so your first Spider-Man story covered 2 of those segments. So you had the 6-issue segment and then an ad, and then you had the second story segment and then an ad, and then the bell ringer or whatever the next story is.
All comics were pretty much like this in the Silver Age from Marvel to DC. Like if you picked up an issue of Superman or Batman, they'd have like 5 or 6 stories in them, and sometimes it would be like multi-part stories. And that's why it was eventually they start doing single issue stories, but they do this for the first few issues of Spider-Man too.
Right. Notice that Spider-Man doesn't have a hyphen yet. It had a hyphen like in the logo at the beginning, but all the lettering is hyphenless.
If you're reading a reprint or Essential Donovan, sometimes they change that. Like they
I see
change
the hyphen, yeah.
Yeah, they changed Peter Palmer's to Peter Parker's in this as well, which I'm kind of like one of those people who, when comics are reprinted, I don't want them to fix the mistakes. I want to see them in all their glory. Mistakes
Yeah,
and all.
as much
Like,
as
Glory in quotation marks.
I don't want Greedo to shoot first, and I'm the same way with my comics. It's kind of
like watching the growth, watching the development, seeing how that, because Stanley put the hyphen in to make Spider-Man look different to Superman, like the word,
Yes.
but he hadn't come up with that idea yet. Obviously, whenever they were doing this first issue.
He wanted Spider-Man to be different from Superman, but he had him work at a newspaper that had the word daily in it, and date somebody that worked at the newspaper, and have a red and blue scheme. Oh, and wear glasses.
Guards, take Bertone away.
I'm not saying that Spider-Man and Superman are the same person or that they're like super similar, but there's a lot of similarities in these early issues.
It's kind of one of those things
that could have been avoided.
It's like Battlestar Galactica, the 2 versions of Battlestar Galactica. At the onset initial concept, there are a lot of similar things you can say about them, and then they take those similarities and go completely different directions with them.
So he goes on TV.
Okay, so part 2 starts out with, now anybody with the intelligence of a 7-year-old knows it, blah, blah, blah. And I read this to Lily when she was 6, and she immediately pointed out that she agreed with the person, what was saying, so therefore she must have the intelligence of a 7-year-old, even though she's only 6.
Can't argue with that logic. Which is funny.
I like how when he's on TV,
TV,
he does like the same thing over and over and over again, which is basically swing on the wall, crawl on the wall, and shoot out candles. And every single time the audience is like, looks like they saw somebody get shot.
Yeah.
well, back then it was like, well, I Love Lucy is a rerun, although I think I Love Lucy was done at this point, so they were all reruns.
Well, let's think about In the Box here. Like, at this point, these people might remember or have learned about in school the heroes from World War II in the 50s, but really right now they have the Fantastic Four and probably rumors of a monster out in the Southwest somewhere. But this is a superhero they can actually put on television and watch him do his amazing things over and over again. And things that no one could really do. So I can kind of see it. So he finishes his first show, and there's a scene with the burglar, whose real name I think is Big Teeth Jones. Just the way he looks whenever he's in the elevator.
Yeah, his name's
Well,
Carradine.
They
I
call
couldn't-
him Dennis Carradine in Spider-Man 3, and they got that because in the Clone Saga, you find out he has a daughter whose name is Jessica Carradine. So people assume that because her last name is Carradine, that must be the name of the father, which isn't necessarily the case, you know. 'Cause
Yeah, the
fathers
only thing
don't-
I could get is that he hadn't been named, but his last name might be Carradine. Other than
Yeah.
that, he's the burglar forever and ever, amen.
Even when they bring him back in Marv Wolfman's run, they never refer to him by name. And like there's a scene where Peter finds out that the burglar escaped from jail, and like he goes into a room to find out a name, and then you see him leave the room and he's like, so it's him, the burglar who killed Uncle Ben. And then like there's even that you said that you stopped reading around Spider-Man Maximum Carnage, and that the backup for the first Maximum Carnage story is Peter's in like an alternate reality. I think the spider didn't bite him or something. And then like he realizes that there's a burglar on the loose, and he's thinking, burglar? The burglar! Oh no, Uncle Ben!
His first name is The.
Wait a minute, the burglar!
No, I think it's interesting to note that we're kind of skipping around here, but like the guy who's chasing after the burglar is the same guy who tells Peter that who's on the scene and tells Peter that Uncle Ben was shot. I don't
think it's the same guy.
That's kind of convenient, but I thought that worked.
Dicko draws everybody the same.
Yeah, the police captain we see later has a mustache and has an actual police uniform. This guy has a kind of useless security guard, and his name is Baxter Bigelow.
You can't be serious.
No, seriously, his name is Baxter Bigelow.
No, it's not.
Shut the heck! I want a source.
Okay,
Not even. Well,
You're editing Wikipedia right now, and then you're
his
gonna
name is unrevealed here. He's next in Amazing Spider-Man number 200. He's named in
That sounds like a criminal.
the Daily Bugle Civil War newspaper special in 2006.
Holy heck! I did not know that.
Oh my god.
I don't even think JR knew that in all of his infinite wisdom.
Baxter
There's no question-
frackin'
there's no
Bigelow,
question
dude.
for trivia game.
Yeah, I'll have to say that. I love how, by the way, because it's showing that more Spider-Man. This time, instead of just merely shooting a candle, he's shooting the candle that's being held by a woman. Whoa, big twist.
Ooh.
It's funny because lots of versions of the adaptation of the origin, they'll have the burglar the night that he gets away go to the Parker house and shoot Uncle Ben. Then that's what
Right.
they did in the movie and in the '90s show and in a few of the other versions. Like it'll be Peter coming home that night and finding. But this time, days pass and
It's
There
a
are so many
natural
different
way to
versions
make the story flow in a different medium, but in a written medium, you could have days or weeks or years go by between the two, and in this case, it's days.
Marv
Like-
Wolfman was like really bothered by the fact that a burglar could go from robbing the TV studio to going all the way to Forest Hills like days later and robbing a house. So
My
he could
dad
do
actually
this.
had the same problem. He always said that never made sense to him.
Wait, what is it that's not making sense? Why could he
Or
not?
maybe it was John Byrne that said that because both of them retconned it. Marv Wolfman and John Byrne both retconned. Like,
I never thought it was a big deal. I mean, a crook's a crook. I mean, I don't
Yeah.
see why you can't go from a.
well, they
a
never
bill-
say where the TV studio is either.
Right.
They
You
did
imagine it's somewhere in the city, but you don't know that.
Well, Peter lives in Queens, Forest Hills, actually.
Yeah. Well, it's not even named where Peter lives here. I mean,
Right.
I don't even think. Do they even say New York in this? Come to think of it, I don't think they do. I mean, they say Midtown High, I believe. Yeah, Midtown High is only professional wallflower.
But seriously,
Actually, it's kind of
Midtown High, I mean, that is the name of a school in New York, but to me, as a kid, I never thought New York. I always thought Midtown was like a generic name.
There's so many different versions of this. Like JMS himself, I think, like I said, like 3 different versions of the origin. From one where there's a panel where Peter's actually holding Uncle Ben's corpse to another one where Aunt May knows his identity and she says that they got in an argument and he walked away and she never saw him again. To other stuff. I mean, I think this version is the most solid because at the end of the day, this is what all happened. But there are some other. Even in the comics, there are so many other versions, which is kind of funny to think about.
I just don't understand why is there a fault and why do people have a problem with him doing a burglary here and then days later doing another burglary in Forest Hills?
Because it was I guess years later when it was established, like the proximity of these places. So if you haven't heard the retcon in the Marv Wolfman run, the burglar's looking for buried treasure,
Right, I remember that,
and it's in Peter Parker's house.
which is awesome, which is
There's
absolutely awesome.
there's buried, and he fakes Aunt May's death and everything, like so
Right.
he can get this buried treasure.
Stupidest thing ever.
And since Mysterio's in that story, you'd think Mysterio was the one faking the death.
Yeah, because he did the nursing home scam.
Right, I've
So-
actually not read that yet, but
So John Byrne later like retconned it in chapter 1, which everyone hated, where like because John Byrne also thought that the buried treasure thing was stupid, but he wanted to explain why the burglar was doing it in Forest Hills. So he did this thing about how like Spider-Man thought that Spider-Man was his partner or something. It's really stupid. Like this guy's convinced that Spider-Man's his partner, and they've had like almost no contact. And like I guess he saw that like Uncle Ben, bought a computer, and he's like, "Ooh, these guys are rich. I better come back here later." Because instead of they buy the microscope here, and like
Yeah.
John Byrne's like, "Huh, microscope? I'm gonna make them buy him a computer because I'm John Byrne. I do that."
I'm John Byrne.
Now, this is the microscope that he leaves on Uncle Ben's grave and then still has years later.
Shut up.
Yeah. Yeah, they later
this
retconned
is
that
this
too,
is the
saying that
morphing microscope here.
It's also
No.
true to know that Ditko is like his design of Spider-Man. The webbing on his costume is inverted, like on the first panel on page 8, and then again the headshot on page 9. The webbing on his mask is inverted to where it typically is. It's kind of hard to describe without showing.
Oh no, I know what you're saying. The way the curvatures of the web go.
Yeah, exactly. And a lot of times in these early issues, you'll see when they show Spider-Man from the back of the head, it doesn't match up to what it is on the front of the face. It's kind of even Romita does that, so it's kind of funny to notice that.
That's interesting. I
so-
see exactly what you're talking about. It's kind of weird. I wonder which way it's supposed to be. Are the curves supposed to go towards his eyes or towards the back of his head?
It's supposed to like zoom in instead of like kind of blow out. Like because I do draw Spider-Man a lot, so kind of gotta memorize.
Because at the top of page 9,
everything.
everything's blowing away from his head.
It's supposed to be like like on page let me see if whenever they get it right. Like on page 8 when he's talking to the cop or the security guard. That's how it's supposed to be.
Okay, where everything's kind of going into the center of his face.
Yes.
It's like
And then
Rorschach. It morphs.
Yeah, it's a Rorschach mask.
Yeah, it morphs when he's talking. So
And
he
then
blows
President
his secret
Fred-
identity, as we find out 20 years later.
He blew his secret
When he
identity.
goes when he goes out the window to go get Uncle Ben's killer.
Is that where Mary Jane
I didn't get
sees
it
it?
first.
That's where Mary Jane sees it. That's what we
Oh,
later
that's
find
so
out.
awesome.
In the Parallel Lives one shot from the 80s, and in Untold Tales of Spider-Man issue 16, they show you the same scene. So, way to
There
go,
was a
Peter!
guy-
9 pages into your first story.
For
You
some
know,
reason,
you're
I
all-
had the impression that the whole Mary Jane finding out that he was Peter Parker, that Spider-Man was Peter Parker so early, was a Chapter 1 thing. I haven't read Chapter 1. I haven't read.
There was a dude
John
who
Byrne
wrote
put it later in chapter 1.
Sorry,
John Byrne, I guess, had a problem with Mary Jane knowing from Amazing Fantasy 15, so John Byrne instead had her know from Amazing Fantasy issue like 4 or 5. Like he had her like see it like when he went after Doctor Doom or something.
I was just gonna say, like, real quick, there was a guy who commented on one of my reviews. I think it was like the last episode of Spectacular Spider-Man, how he really, really hated the retcon with Mary Jane knowing from the very beginning, and I don't understand why. It's not that big of a deal.
Well, we do have a sort of oblique reference, possible first mention of the Watsons when he says your aunt is next door, the neighbors are looking after her.
Yeah.
And it turns out that they're the neighbors.
Yeah.
That's determined later because we actually see in Parallel Lives Aunt Meg inside the Watson house and Anna Watson and I think Madeline and Gail Watson, which was Mary Jane's mother and aunt, respectively, who were visiting from out of town, comforting her.
Gotcha.
Mary Jane was 14, he was 15. So.
Yeah.
So he swings away in a hateful vengeance.
That's his
Web
first
swinging,
time web
first time.
swinging, by the way.
Yeah, and I actually like it because they actually,
Show where it hits.
yeah, they show the actual mechanics, and then whenever he's swinging away from that flagpole, they show the web like behind him, flapping in the air. I think that establishing that here and how it works is good because they hardly ever do it again after this.
I think this is my favorite scene, the confrontation, because it's done so dramatically in the majority of the media representations. Like the 60s cartoon, like the Ralph Bakshi reboot of the 60s cartoon, there's a lot of like really nice noir kind of paintings and music when he confronts them. And I thought it was done really, like, I think probably the best scene in the 2002 movie was like where the music stops and he realizes who the burglar is. I remember in the audience when we were watching for the first time, my mom actually gasped when it showed that it was the same guy from the TV studio. And Ditko does a really good job of blacking out his face until Spider-Man knocks him over and his hat falls off. So I thought this whole thing was really done well.
Yeah, it is a really, really good scene. The art is really dark and moody, and you really get a sense of this warehouse is, two spits from falling over on itself.
Yeah, and they never fix it because like people come back to it later, even in the Clone Saga, and it's like, why hasn't this thing fallen over yet? Like Galactus has attacked the city like 90 times.
That's really stupid.
This thing looks like it can't even support the burglar. And
Surely, if Hulk were going to smash, he would smash this, right?
Hulk smash burglar hideout.
I mean, you got Namor like invading, every other week, and like
Now, Josh,
floods.
you mentioned how a lot of the Essentials and reprints kind of fix things. I've seen a lot of times where Spider-Man realizes who the burglar is, his eyes kind of bug out.
Yeah.
But thankfully, my version doesn't have that because I hate it whenever I see that.
Oh yeah, it totally has pupils in the original version when he's looking at the burglar's face.
I really don't like that.
In the '90s show, he had like Billy Ray Cyrus hair.
Yeah, and then I show his eyes bug out too, like his the mask eyes on his mask, like a really like.
I totally don't like moving Spider-Man lenses. I understand what they're trying to do with emoting the face because you can't see his face, but I really don't like it. I wish the lenses would stay static. Don't make him squinty-eyed on his mask.
I understand that.
And so he sees the burglar's face and his teeth, and he recognizes him.
Because the burglar is quite ugly. Yeah, it looks like a jacket.
You got to think he only saw that burglar for a split second, and it was days ago. I mean, the guy was running, so.
Shut up!
No, I'm gonna poke a hole through this classic story. Gosh darn it!
But he has like freckles and a distinctive nose and the buck teeth and bushy eyebrows.
Those eyebrows.
Also, Peter's mask isn't a mask. It's like a full over hoodie, which they've done that trick with Batman a lot, where it's either like something you just pull over your face or an actual mask. So there's a lot of incontinuity with that kind of thing, but I think it looks good for this panel.
You're right. It is like a cowl.
You can explain it away that this is an early version of the costume, and that like he made modifications to it in the coming weeks.
And then like the final panel, which you have like the quote that was never said.
The original phrasing of the with great power there must also come great responsibility.
Which was not said by Uncle Ben. That was later affixed to him much later.
Yes, for those of you who only know the movie.
I believe it's Spider-Man versus Wolverine. I double-checked that because I know I asked that on the Spider-Man Crawlspace podcast when I did Spider-Man Jeopardy.
Right.
And I double-checked it then because I remember this fact, and I just don't have all those notes and everything in front of me, but I believe it was Spider-Man versus Wolverine. That was the first time it was kind of affixed to Uncle Ben. And then the 90s series and the movie kind of pounded into everyone's head that Uncle Ben said it to him.
And then the last line in this story is a total lie. It says, "Be sure to see the next issue of Amazing Fantasy for the further amazing exploits of America's most different new teenage idol, Spider-Man."
Yeah, I don't have that on my version.
And there was no more Amazing Fantasy.
The next page I have is The Secret of Spider-Man's Mask, which I figured wasn't in the original version because the art is actually much better.
It's in the first annual, I believe, the first Amazing Spider-Man annual.
Yeah, they split a lot of those features up from that first annual and put them throughout the Essentials.
And I had them in the. I didn't have the Sinister Six story from the annual, but I did have those featurettes in the back of my 3 paperbacks when I was a kid. I was kind of peeved that A, I didn't have the Sinister Six story and they referenced it, and B, I didn't have the Strange Tales Annual #2 story and they referenced that too in the story, and I didn't have them, so I was kind of peeved.
Any closing thoughts on Amazing Fantasy 15? Like the story that everyone knows front and back.
So I actually do have some technical stuff, but anyone have any thoughts on the actual story?
Just real quick, I think that I mentioned that a couple weeks ago on one of our friend Walter's podcasts that I think a story down the line, the Master Planner story, is like one of the best comic book stories of all time. But I think this is still like in the top 3 because if you look at it as a one shot, it's really, 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 really good.
It is. It really stands up as a one-shot story.
Like just that Twilight Zone kind of take on it makes it such a compelling story. And the final line with great power comes great responsibility just resonates with you. So this is a really awesome story, no matter when it was told or how.
If the story ended there with him basically fracking up and his uncle dying because of it, and that line, that's awesome.
Mm-hmm.
It's an Aesop's fable, because what a lot of people lose when they do the recap of this story and when they adapt it into other media, he was basically a conceited jerk. He was, I'm gonna look out for number one. He was a conceited jerk. He was a Hollywood hotshot or whatever.
Well, he was made sympathetic at the beginning, but once he had a chance to do some real good, he did what he wanted to do. He did things to help himself. He did say that he cared about his aunt and uncle, but he still, he didn't care about helping anybody else, and then he pays for that.
And even when Gary Conway did Parallel Lives, he showed what was going on with Peter at the time, and he has Peter having a talk with Uncle Ben, and Uncle Ben's talk. I don't think that Gary Conway really I think Gary Conway kind of missed the point, which is a shame because I love Gary Conway. That Peter was, kind of on a conceited high then, and he kind of lost that when he was telling Peter through that period. They recently did a miniseries a year or two ago. I think it was called Spider-Man with Great Power, Responsibility, or something like that.
What did y'all think of that miniseries? Because I read it as it came out.
It was interesting.
I
think it's out of continuity.
Yeah, I think it's an interesting take, but I would not want it to be in continuity.
It takes place between, for the listeners who don't know, it takes place between the panels of Amazing Fantasy 15, and it's basically like the adventures of Spider-Man as a media star.
Right.
And at the end, you think that you're seeing the scene where Uncle Ben dies, but it's just the police are there because Peter's missing. Because
right.
Peter's been so wrapped up in what he's doing, he forgot about Aunt May.
And he gets wrapped up with the woman in that story. Does he actually get laid in that story?
No, I don't think that they implied that he got laid, and
Okay.
It's really sad that Spider-Man fans have debated this, myself included, but there's actually different takes on when Spider-Man lost his virginity.
And we're going to talk about that when we get more in depth.
My
in the
God.
relationship.
Very first episode, we have to mention that.
We're at least going to pull it out whenever
He's 15 in the stories that we're discussing now, and we're talking about the boy's virginity. He's a child.
It's a few episodes. So some first appearance. I went ahead and made a first appearance list because this issue has a more extensive one than anything else. Because we have, of course, Peter Parker and Spider-Man, Ben Parker, May Parker, Flash Thompson, Liz Allen, Sally Averill, the science teacher that we'll later know as Mr. Warren, the burglar who is just the burglar, Crusher Hogan, the agent Maxie Schiffman, Seymour O'Reilly is one of the classmates. Baxter Bigelow is the security guard who yells him in the hallway. Officer O'Brien is the guy who meets him at his house with the mustache when Ben dies. I don't know if he ever shows up again besides in flashbacks, but he does have a name.
I think in Spider-Man 200, maybe he's the guy that deals with Peter.
And maybe in the Peter Parker Spectacular Spider-Man 60, that around there's a revisit to the story.
And of course, to tie it back to your other podcast, John, in Ultimate Version, it was Captain Stacy who was the cop at the scene.
Was it really? I don't remember that.
I know at least when he knocked at the warehouse, it was Captain Stacy.
Okay. You may be totally right. I just forgot that. Because we just talked about we just recorded the episode recently where he dies. So, and spoiler. We
haven't even met Gwen yet, and you're already killing off her dad.
I know, right? But that's in the Ultimate Universe. He doesn't necessarily have to die in this universe.
Right.
My source I was looking at suggested that the retarded child with his unobservant mother, they actually come back at some point. Are y'all aware of that at all?
What? Not every single character has to come back.
I read. Let me see what it said. Where is the freaking?
I like my idea for it much better.
Marvel Comics Presents number 120.
Oh my goodness.
From 1993.
I must track down this story.
You and your characters, you can't let anything go, can you?
And of course, the radioactive spider, who dies, but he counts.
Yeah, this is the last.
Oh no! Do you know what happens to the spider after he dies?
After he dies, or before he dies?
After he dies.
What?
This guy named Carl King.
Oh God.
Yeah, Donovan remembers. He was a classmate of Peter Parker's who followed him to the science exhibit. And he saw this happen. So actually, two people discover Spider-Man's identity. This story, Mary Jane and Carl King. So yeah, he kind of sucks at this. He eats the dead spider, and he becomes a bunch of little and he can jump from body to body. It's a really bad story.
Wow. I so don't want to read that.
Seymour O'Reilly was just the name that they gave to the unnamed classmate, and they killed him off in Marvel Knights during Peter's 10-year high school reunion. But he did get to find out that Peter was Spider-Man 2 seconds before he died.
If you're going to die in a Spider-Man comic, you get to find out that he's Spider-Man.
Yeah, he's like, wait, Peter Parker's Spider-Man, and then the new Venom, which was It wasn't Matt Gargan. It wasn't Eddie Brock.
It was like a
The
crime
one in
boss.
between
It
them.
was like
Just bought the costume.
Angelino or something. Yeah.
Yeah.
He like he kills him right away.
I think I read
Uh,
that story because I read some of that Marvel Knight stuff.
Yeah, Liz isn't named in this story, but I think that if you see how Liz is drawn later and you see the girl in this book, you can. I think it's safe to say that that's Liz.
Yeah, most of the names that I gave are given later. Like Flash has a first name. I don't think he has. No, he gets a last name. He does not get Eugene in this book. And,
Yeah, no, Eugene comes much later.
Yeah,
and
it does.
May Riley Parker. We don't find out that she's Riley until much later either. So most of the names that I just mentioned are only faces or partial names in this story.
Yeah, no. In fact, Seymour O'Reilly wasn't even named until Marvel Knights. They just called him Seymour in some early issues, and
Yeah, okay, because I
it-
do see here his name was revealed in Marvel Knight Spider-Man number 8, 2005.
I remember when that
their
happened.
choice was for Seymour Butts. They said in the interview.
So, just for those listening who've never actually seen the actual Amazing Fantasy or a scan of it, there were some Lee Ditko backcasts. We talked about them earlier. They're actually pretty decent. The Bell Ringer is a Believe in Angels kind of story where a man stays behind to toll a disaster warning bell to evacuate an island, and he's then saved from disaster by heavenly lights. There's a story called Man in the Mummy Case, which has a crook running from the cops and hiding in a museum. A mummy comes and tells him to hide in the mummy case and he'll be safe. So the guy hides in the mummy case, but then he's transported to be Mr. Slave Labor Man in ancient Egypt. And then there's a one you were talking about earlier, Josh, Martians Among Us, that has a Martian ship crash land. There's a manhunt, and the cute little suburban couple who's talking like they're hiding from the Martians, but then they go out and she gets caught, and he is calling his friend. He's like, no, if they caught her, then they'll find out that we're Martians and come after us.
A bunch of arms, just like Peter Parker will in
Yeah.
spoiler alert, issue 100.
But they're cute. They're not terrible.
I think, I've not read these because I don't have them, but I think that this is, I think, when we can start to say when, because, this was done Marvel style, which were the scripts and which were the artists during the process. Was this, these sound like something that Ditko just came up with and Stan Lee came up with a dialogue, not AF-15, but these backup stories.
Yeah, I don't know when that quote Marvel style actually started being used. I know they used it with Fantastic Four and all these superhero stories. I don't know when they started using it on their non-superhero stuff, if they were already doing it by this point or what.
It's funny because towards the end of the Lee Ditko run, it's
Blatantly obvious.
yeah, there was lots of
year, the
contradictions.
last year where Ditko was on, they were not speaking.
Yeah, I heard it was a
Yeah.
couple years that he was just mailing in his work and they were never talking.
And Stan didn't know what was supposed to be going on, so he would just fill in the dialogue as he saw fit.
Yeah, some of it's very obvious. We'll get to it in the episode.
Oh God, Lee Ditko, why are you making all your characters so angry?
There is a letter from the editor notifying readers that rather than continue 5 stories every month, the first 2 or more stories are going to be replaced by Spider-Man. There are a couple other minor notes made in the letter, but they're boring. And it turns out that when they sent this copy off to the printers, the next day Marty Goodman said, cancel Amazing Fantasy, and Stanley was like, damn, I just lied to the kids in that letter. Oh well. And a few months later, Spider-Man got his own book.
Because Stan Lee is really bothered by lying, because Stan Lee never, ever, ever lied again.
No, he only exaggerated 60 times.
Well, yeah, he
And-
also has he luckily has a bad memory, so he can always count on.
And he talks about now that he put Spider-Man in Amazing Fantasy 15 because he knew it was going to get canceled. And it's like, well, hold on, no. Then why about that letter? And what about that other story what's Stan? You're confusing me.
He
No
said
one-
that as little as a few months later, because that's actually in the reply to one of the letters in issue 3 or 4.
Yeah, his own life has continuity errors. I mean,
Awesome. Stan Lee, the retcon.
I know he probably does he have kids?
He has one daughter. He had I know the first child they had either died young or was a miscarriage, but he has one living daughter.
Okay, see, I never read his autobiography, but yeah, you got to think if he ever says things to his kids, and if they ever got to a point, it's like, why is Daddy a liar? What? What do you mean I was? What's going on? Because every kid has that moment where they realize that their parents are not always right. But if you're Stan Lee's kid, it's even worse because
When is he
he's
actually
such
telling
a-
the truth?
he's such a liar about everything.
A couple of last notes. Putting a superhero strip in the pages of an anthology book was nothing new to Marvel. They had done it lots during the World War II era and the 50s, but this was the first time they did it in the Silver Age because the Fantastic Four and the Incredible Hulk had both been given their own self-titled books. But very soon after, there, of course, would be other horror sci-fi anthology books that would turn their lead strips over to Thor, Ant-Man, Iron Man, and the Human Torch. And when Amazing Fantasy was canceled, Two Gun Kid was revived and put in its place in the publishing schedule. Because at this time, Marvel's agreement with their printer was for a set number of books to be published over a 2-month period, so putting superheroes in anthology books allowed them to keep their book count the same but introduce new stories. And creating a book devoted to a superhero required the cancellation of some other title.
It's funny, too, because you said that canceling some titles made room for others. The Incredible Hulk, when it was canceled after 6 issues, somebody said, and within Marvel, I don't remember who, that actually made way for Amazing Spider-Man to have its own title.
It happened near the same time. I was actually looking at this before I came on because I wanted to be able to say that. Linda Carter's Student Nurse got canceled to make way for Amazing Spider-Man. Yeah. Amazing Spider-Man 1 and Incredible Hulk 6 came out at the same time. That was Hulk's last issue, and then its slot was taken by Sergeant Fury.
But then Hulk was revived in,
Tales to Astonish.
Which eventually turned into Hulk, which really messes up the numbering.
Because Thor and Hulk have these really huge numbers, but their first 60 or 80 odd issues...
Thor is a pack of lies. I'll tell you right now.
Thor didn't come into 83 of Journey into Mystery, so you say Thor 600, you mean except for the first 82.
Yeah,
exactly. It's like that. Yeah, well, you must.
Well, because Tales to Astonish became the Incredible Hulk. So,
right.
Well, I think Steve Ditko I think got onto Hulk and when they were doing Tales to Astonish, which is funny because Betty
didn't
Ross was the girlfriend there, and they called her Betty Brant a few times in that book. Whoops.
I think so. Yeah.
And that the first appearance of Hulk, or was that Kirby?
Kirby did Hulk's first.
Yeah,
appearance.
Kirby did Hulk's. I think the whole 6-issue run was Kirby.
Okay.
When it became Tales to Astonish, that's when it was Ditko for a long time.
And so, but in the months between Amazing Fantasy 15 and Spider-Man #1, you had the introduction of Thor and the return of Ant-Man, because he had been used once in a one-off story, and they actually took the idea and turned it into a superhero story. So now,
story later where Peter is like, why can't I have great fame like the Fantastic Four or Ant-Man?
Yeah, because everybody loves Ant-Man.
Who nobody would have known anything about at that point, I don't think. But
yeah, Ant-Man had been around for some time by the time we hit Amazing Spider-Man #1. So
okay,
the Ant-Man.
He actually he got brought back to Tales to Astonish right after Amazing Fantasy 15 hit the stands. What we kind of want to do is, not that we've been already poking the fun at the story already, but Josh, do you have like a favorite line or favorite corniest line from this whole story we had here?
You stick to science, son. We'll stick to the chicks.
Donovan, do you have a favorite part or favorite line?
I can't look at any corny lines. The bulk of those are niches to follow, but I really do like the last line. I'll say it again. And so a legend is born, and a new name is added to the roster of those who make the world of fantasy the most exciting realm of all.
That's pretty awesome. Oh, Stan.
You stick to writing corny monologue. We'll stick to the chicks.
I seriously like the whole I'm not quite a supervillain part when he's talking to the security guard, and he's like, sorry, pal, that's your job. I'm through being pushed around by anyone. From now on, I just look out for #1. That means me.
So you see the motivational picture with that panel saying, Spider-Man, dick.
So yes, this podcast is hosted at amazingspiderman.libsyn.com. Don't have an email set up yet, but I hope to have that done by the next episode or 2. So we'll see how that goes. Bear with us. We're just getting started. And thank you for listening to Amazing Spider-Man Classics. Good night.
Spider-Man does whatever a spider can. Spins a web any size, catches thieves just like flies. Look out, here comes the Spider-Man. Is he strong? Listen, bud, he's got radioactive blood. Can he swing from a thread? Take a look overhead. Hey there goes the Spider-Man. In the chill of night, at the scene of a crime, like a streak of light, he arrives just in time. Spider-Man, Spider-Man, friend friendly neighborhood Spider-Man. Wealth and fame, he's ignored. Action is his reward to him. Life is a great big hang-up. Wherever there's a hang-up, you'll find the Spider-Man.
Thank you for listening to...
Amazing Spider-Man Classics.
Dude, come on. Whoa, teenage. I mean, okay. I'm on a lot of podcasts. I'm allowed to forget the name once in a while, but dude, you
No, that was awesome. That was awesome, John.
come on, dude.
Okay, yes. Thank you for listening to Amazing Spider-Man Podcast. Good night.
See you later.
I said it wrong.
Dude,
Totally said it wrong again.
Spider-Man. Really?
Yeah.
Did
You got to be able to do this, right? I've been doing this for a few months now. Thank you for listening to Amazing Spider-Man Classics. Good night.